Before there was a king, before a stone flew through the air, before the roar of a crowd, there was silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of fear. The armies of Israel were camped on the hills, but their courage had fled. Swords stayed sheathed, shields trembled in hands, eyes stared into the valley, where fear had taken form. And then he came, Goliath of Gath, a giant over 9 feet tall, cloaked in armor like iron skin. His voice thundered like war itself. "Choose you a man, let him come down to me." He laughed as Israel stayed frozen. Not once, not twice, 40 days, morning and evening. The challenge echoed across the land. Even Saul, king of Israel, the tallest among them, hid in his tent, silent. The people of God stood powerless, their faith buried under fear. But while they looked for a warrior with a sword, God was preparing a worshiper with a sling. 1 Samuel 17:11. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Before David, there was fear, and before fear, there was rebellion. Israel had no king, no direction. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes, even when it was wrong. They had judges, but not unity. And in their chaos they cried out, "Give us a king to lead us." So God gave them Saul, a tall man, a strong man, a man who looked like a leader, but would not follow God's voice. When Goliath rose, Saul hid. When the people needed faith, they found only fear. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Judges 21:25, KJV. God was not silent, even when kings failed, even when giants shouted, God whispered. To his prophet Samuel he said, "I have found someone else, a man after my own heart. Not in a palace, not among the famous. In a quiet little town called Bethlehem lived a boy named David. Not royalty, a shepherd. While no one was watching, David worshipped. He sang to heaven. He fought off lions and bears. He walked with God when no one else did. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart." 1 Samuel 13:14, KJV. God sent Samuel to the house of Jesse. He said, "One of his sons will be king." Jesse proudly brought out his strongest sons, tall, handsome, warrior-ready. But God said no to everyone. Samuel asked, "Are these all your sons?" Jesse hesitated. "There's the youngest. He's out with the sheep." David entered, dirty from the field, smelling of pasture, with no crown, no armor. But heaven stood still. God said, "That's the one." Because man looks at the outside, but the Lord sees the heart. Man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. 1 Samuel 16:7, KJV. David didn't grow up in a palace. He grew up in the wild, among rocks and rivers, among sheep and silence. But it was there that he learned what Saul never did. He learned to listen, to sing, to wait, to trust. He wasn't shaped by men. He was shaped by moments with God. While kings sat on thrones, David danced in meadows. While warriors trained with swords, David trained with trust. His worship was louder than any army, and the one who heard it was about to send him to war. He chose David also, his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. Psalm 78:70, KJV. He came into the valley like a storm in armor, not once, not twice, but for 40 days. Each morning Goliath rose from the Philistine line, towering, unstoppable, shouting across the silence, "Send me a man, let him come down to me." But Israel had no answer, not a whisper, not a sword raised. The sound of his footsteps echoed louder than the army's voice. He wasn't just challenging Israel, he was mocking God himself. Bronze flashed on his chest. A spear like a tree trunk rested on his shoulder. His voice cracked through the sky like thunder, and behind him the Philistine camp laughed. But on the other hill, Israel stood still. Not even Saul, the tallest among them, moved. He who was crowned to lead now shrank behind canvas and fear. The king, who once stood head and shoulders above the rest, now couldn't stand at all. But while Goliath thundered below, God was whispering above, preparing not a warrior, but a worshipper, not a sword, but a sling. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. 1 Samuel 17:11 KJV. Back in Bethlehem, life moved quietly. David, the youngest of Jesse's sons, was not called to fight. He was sent to serve. One morning, Jesse handed him a bundle of bread and cheese. "Take this to your brothers at the battlefield. See how they're doing." David didn't argue. He didn't complain. He obeyed. But heaven knew this was no ordinary errand. The sun had barely risen when David set off, the sheep still grazing in the mist. He carried no sword, just food and faith. As he approached the valley, the rhythm of his steps slowed. The earth trembled beneath a distant roar.
What is that sound?
The battlefield opened before him like a stage. Trembling soldiers, fearful faces, and, in the valley, a giant. But David had not come by accident. He had been sent, not just by Jesse, but by the God who sees the unseen. And before the day was done, that bread would feed warriors, and that valley would witness history. 1 Samuel 17:17. And Jesse said unto David his son, "Take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn, and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp." David looked across the valley. A giant roared, and soldiers shrank. But something in David's heart began to burn. He asked the men nearby,
Who is this man that defies the army of the living God?
They stared at him, confused, even annoyed. A soldier muttered, "He's just a shepherd boy." But the question made its way to King Saul's tent, and the boy who brought bread stood before the king. David stood firmly. "Let me fight him." Saul was shocked. You're only a boy. He's been trained for battle since he was your age." But David didn't flinch. "When lions and bears came for my father's sheep, I chased them down. I rescued the lamb, and this giant, he will fall just like them, because the Lord who delivered me then will deliver me now." David wasn't boasting. He wasn't bluffing. He was remembering. 1 Samuel 17:37. "The Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion, and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." The tent of the king grew quiet. Saul, tall, broad, wrapped in armor, stared at the boy who dared to fight a giant. He gave the command. His servants rushed forward, bringing the royal armor, a heavy bronze breastplate, a sword long and gleaming, a helmet fit for a warrior. They placed the armor on David. It hung from his shoulders. The sword dragged at his side. The helmet slipped forward over his eyes. David took a few steps, slow, awkward. Then he stopped. He said, "I cannot go with these, I have not proven them." He removed the king's armor, piece by piece, and laid it gently down, as if returning something that was never his. David wasn't being disrespectful. He was being real. The king's tools weren't built for a shepherd. David had already been trained in a different kind of battlefield. He stepped outside and looked to the ground. There, beside the stream, he chose 5 smooth stones, 1 for Goliath, and 4 for the giants that might follow. Then he stood tall, not in armor but in confidence, not dressed like a soldier, but clothed in faith. David stood alone, no sword, no shield, just a sling, and the quiet confidence of someone who knew he wasn't walking alone. He stepped down into the valley. One step, then another. The rocks crunched beneath his bare feet. The wind moved gently across the hills. On one side, the Philistines, laughing, mocking. On the other, Israel, holding their breath, still not believing. And there, in the heart of the valley, a figure began to move. He was massive, shoulders like stone walls, footsteps like thunder. He came closer and closer, mocking David with every step. But David's heart didn't flinch, because the battle wasn't between a boy and a giant. It was between pride and promise. 1 Samuel 17:45, KJV. Then said David to the Philistine, "Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied." The giant stopped, his eyes locked on the boy. This was the champion Israel had sent. Goliath's voice thundered across the valley. "Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks?" He sneered at David, insulted, offended, towering. He cursed David by his gods, laughing at the small shepherd who dared to stand before him. "Come here," the giant bellowed, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." But David didn't flinch. The boy who came with bread now stood with boldness. The boy who sang to sheep now spoke for the living God. The Philistine may have roared, but heaven was listening. 1 Samuel 17:43-44, KJV. And the Philistine said unto David, "Am I a dog, that thou comest to me with staves?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field." But David stood his ground, no armor, no sword, only the name of the Lord and a fire in his soul. And then he spoke, not with fear, but with heavenly authority.
This day will the Lord deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the bodies of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, so that all the earth may know there is a God in Israel.
The boy's voice echoed like thunder. He wasn't boasting in himself, he was boasting in God. And everyone gathered here will know, the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And with that, the shepherd took a step forward, no turning back. God was about to move. 1 Samuel 17:46-47, KJV. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. David raised his voice, standing firm before the towering giant.
You come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied.
The boy's eyes blazed with courage. The valley held its breath.
This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and all this assembly shall know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands.
The armies held their breath. David stood still, eyes fixed on the towering figure ahead. He reached into his pouch and pulled out one smooth stone. He placed it in his leather sling. Then David began to swing. Faster, tighter, one rotation, then 2, 3. With a snap of his wrist, he released. Crack! The stone tore through the air and struck Goliath square in the forehead with a force that echoed across the valley. Boom! The giant blinked, his eyes widened. 1 Samuel 17:47, KJV. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." Then his legs gave way. Goliath's mouth opened in shock, but no sound came out. Time seemed to slow. The valley watched, frozen. And then, the Philistine champion crashed face first into the dirt with a thunderous slam. Goliath the giant was no more, and just like that, the shouting stopped. The valley that had echoed with threats now held its breath. The armies stood still, Israel in stunned awe, the Philistines in frozen fear. One stone, one sling, one boy, one God. David stood over the fallen warrior, not with pride, but with reverence. He hadn't won by size or strength or sword. He had won because God fights for the humble. What started as a delivery of bread became the downfall of a giant, and the name of the Lord was lifted high. The boy with the harp had silenced a battlefield. 1 Samuel 17:50, KJV. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. The boy didn't raise his arms in triumph. He didn't dance, he didn't shout. He stood still, because he knew this victory wasn't his. It belonged to the one who had been with him in the field, in the caves, in the quiet. David had spoken boldly, but only because he knew who God was. He had walked forward, but only because God had gone before him. And now the battlefield was quiet, but heaven was rejoicing. Psalm 27, KJV. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. And just like that, the giant was gone. A hush fell across the valley, stunned silence from both camps. Then the shout began. First a soldier, then another. Then all of Israel surged forward with a roar that shook the hills. The Philistines ran, the Israelites chased. Victory belonged to the Lord. But while the armies fought and fled, David did something no one expected. He walked to the lifeless body of Goliath. No sword of his own, no army beside him, just a sling, a stone, and a calling. He took Goliath's own sword and cut off the head of the fallen enemy, and then he carried it, all the way, to Jerusalem. Later, he was summoned to King Saul. The king asked, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David, still holding the head of the giant, replied, "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." He was still a boy, still a shepherd, but God had seen something no one else did. A warrior, a worshipper, a king in waiting. And all of Israel would remember that day, the day when one faithful boy trusted not in armor or fear, but in the name of the Lord of hosts. 1 Samuel 17:51-58, KJV. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head. And as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him, and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. Tone. David's story didn't end here, and neither does ours. Every battle, every quiet moment, every step of faith, God is writing something greater. If this story encouraged you, there are many more waiting to be told. Subscribe, share, and join us as we bring the Bible to life, one story at a time, because faith still moves stones.